Hi, welcome back to Make Stuff Nation. This is part 4 of how to build a wooden sailboat. In previous episodes, we've done the design work in full scale, built all of the frames, and also made the transom, stem, shear clamps, and chine logs, as well as the keel batten. Today, with those parts complete, we're going to start building the jig that's going to allow us to get the assembly started. The boat should really start to take shape quickly from this point on. The plans for this boat call for a jig that consists of 2 longitudinal members that run the length of the boat, as well as a cross member at each station. We'll attach the stem to the cross member at station 0, and then the frames to each of their respective cross members. This boat is built upside down, and I'm going to follow the gist of this jig design, but I may make some modifications to make it a little more rigid and then to also lift it up off the floor so that I have a pleasant working height. Another thing we'll have to figure out is because the transom is raked, it's obviously not going to sit perpendicular to the level line or baseline of the boat. So I'm going to have to modify the jig so that the transom sits at the appropriate angle. I've taken some basic measurements off of my full-scale plans, and I'm going to head out to the shop and start cutting in these cross members. Let me walk you through what I've accomplished so far. I picked up 2 16-foot long 2x4s from the lumberyard. I also had some 2x10 scrap lying around, and I cut that down to 36-inch lengths. I used those 2x10 pieces to tie the 2 2x4s together. I tried to square up everything as much as possible, and then I added some cross bracing made of 2x4s to keep it from racking and try to keep it square. From there, I used more scrap 2x4s to make some legs to hold the jig up off the floor. That gives me some storage space underneath and will make it more of a comfortable working height once I install the frames. Next, I struck a center line down one of the 2x4s and then measured off an equal distance at either end and struck another center line down the opposing 2x4. From there, I marked off each station on one side and used my beam compass to mark the opposing station perpendicular from it. I then double checked all the measurements and made sure everything was square and in line with the plans. My next step will be to attach the cross members I cut earlier and install them at each station. I have all the cross members attached to the jig. I used a tape measure to get them approximately centered and then checked everything with my levels to make sure everything was level and square. Next, I'm going to strike a center line for the boat using my chalk line, and after that we can start installing frames. The top sides of the cross members will act as my reference line that I have drawn on each frame, and then I'll use a plumb bob to check the frames to make sure they're plumb to the center line and rest of the boat. From there, I'll add some bracing to keep them in place during the rest of the construction. I have the stem, frames, and transom set in their respective places on the jig. To mount them on the jig, I'll lift them up and match up the reference line on each frame with the top of its respective cross member. I'll clamp it in place and then use wood screws to mount it to the jig. Once I've got it screwed into the jig, I'll use a plumb bob to check and make sure that it's square to the jig. Because the transom of the boat is raked, it's not going to sit perpendicular to the jig like I have it set now. I'll have to measure the angles off the layout work we have inside and then build some blocking at the appropriate angle to hold it in place. I've completed mounting frames 1 through 5 onto the jig. I have the stem blocked up approximately to the reference line and lined up with frame number 1. So that'll be the next thing I need to attach. But it's getting kind of late, so I think I'll leave it for tomorrow. Now I'm going to attach the stem to the jig. I've blocked up the stem with a wooden block to approximately align my reference line with the top of the cross member, which is serving as the reference plane for the boat. I've also got the center of the stem centered on the center line for the boat. What I'm going to do now is lightly clamp it in place and then adjust its height and check and make sure that it's plumb. Lift it up just a little bit. Okay, that's the right height. Of course, when you shift one thing, everything else comes out of alignment. Height's good, center line's good, now I just have to make sure it's plumb. Recheck, we're still on center line. And the reference height still checks. I can tighten the clamp and attach it to the jig. Reference height's still good, we're still on center line. And we're still plumb. So that's the stem fixed to the jig. With the reference line of the stem secured to the jig, my next step is going to be to attach the stem to frame number 1. I've just got it taped in place, but what we'll do is we're going to drill a couple holes through the gusset or floor on frame 1 and keep the stem lined up, and we'll use epoxy in this joint to epoxy the stem to frame 1 and then drive a couple screws through to hold it in place. Once the epoxy is cured and I have the transom installed on the jig, we'll install the keel batten. The keel batten will notch into the stem here, and then there will be 2 bolts both through the frame 1 and through the stem, and those will be the main structural components besides the epoxy holding the stem and the frames together. I've also got a new transom ready to epoxy. The reason why I'm having to make a new transom is because on the original transom, the dimensions of the inside face were too small to allow for the bevels. And because the boat tapers out larger as you go forward, the inside face of the transom has wider dimensions than the aft or outside face of the transom. So this time, I've made the transom to the size of the inside face, which is the largest dimensions, and then I'll fair in the bevels from there. I have the transom all ready to epoxy, as well as the stem to frame 1, and so my intent is to use 1 batch of epoxy to secure both of those assemblies. I have the stem in place and epoxy to frame number 1. I used 2 number 10 bronze screws to hold it while the epoxy cures. The new transom is also epoxied together and ready to cure overnight. It's the next day and the epoxy on the stem is cured. The epoxy on the transom is also cured. And what I've done is, off of the full scale plans, I've measured out the length to my 900mm reference line on both legs and struck a line across. To mount the transom on the jig, what I've done is I measured the angle of the transom off the full scale plans, and then I also measured where the frames on it would meet the 900mm reference line. And I constructed a board to be on that angle. The aft edge of this board is even with the front or forward plane of the transom frames. This top corner is level with the 900mm reference line. So that line I drew on the frames of the transom will line up with this top edge and give the transom the correct height, and the board will give it the correct angle. I've also set up this vertical support, and again, I just measured the height and the position off of the full scale plans. With a little bit of adjusting, I've got it clamped in place. I have the reference lines lined up, and I've used the plumb bob to make sure it's aligned with the center line of the boat. Now I'm going to drill a few holes and screw it in place. Here's the transom screwed to the jig. Everything's lining up well. The next task, and probably my last item for this video, is going to be to rough cut the bevels onto the transom, because right now they're just cut square to the face. Alan, what should we do with all the scraps?
Burn them.
Burn them?
Burn them.
That's a great idea. Long day of work. Now to enjoy some nice little fire. What do you think? Good use of the scraps?
I guess. This means you'll never build my patio, right?
Nope. What do you think, Alan? Is it a good fire? Hey, Alan, while we burn the scraps, should we look at the bevels? Or are you just itchy? What do you think? As far as the bevels on the transom, the plans do provide some guidance, but they're only going to be accurate if you use their measurements for the whole design of the boat. Since I did a full scale layout and my measurements are slightly different, these bevels aren't necessarily accurate. What I've done is I've used my full scale plans and then compared the bevels I've calculated to the ones in the plans. For the most part, they're the same. Where the bottom meets the transom, the deck meets the transom, and the keel meets the transom, my bevels match the bevels in the plans. The one that is slightly different is where the sides meet the transom. The plans call for a 16.5 degree bevel. My calculations show 8 to 10 degrees. Because 8 to 10 degrees is more conservative, I'll cut it at that and then fair in the final bevel with a hand plane, which may be actually closer to the 16.5, but I don't want to cut too much. As I've said earlier, I've made this new transom to the dimensions of the inside or forward face. What I've done now is I've taken my old template, which is the size of the outside or aft face of the transom, and traced that on. That'll help me judge to make sure I get the bevels correct, because the bevels on the keel, bottom, and sides will bevel from this forward corner or edge back to this line I've drawn. So I'll be taking off this edge right here. This is the final fit of the transom on the jig. You can see that the roughed in bevels line up nicely with the lines of the bottom and the sides. I used a circular saw and a jig to cut the bevels, but unfortunately my blade was getting really dull, so it made a lot of smoke and left some burn marks. I've cleaned up the bevels with a hand plane just to take off the burn marks and some of the tooth marks. I will have to do a final fair in of the bevels when I start putting the keel, sides, and bottom on the boat. But for now, they're pretty close. This is going to be the end of part 4 of how to build a plywood sailboat. In the next video, I'm going to start fitting the keel batten, shear clamps, and chine logs. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and useful, and I hope you'll tune in for our next installment. Thanks again for watching Make Stuff Nation. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.